As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
It has seemed that Coates was monitoring all his social media, all the news stories surrounded him, and they compiled this 40-page dossier of reasons why Nigel Farage did not align with Coutts Bank core values. Now, you can be sure that there will be all sorts of dodgy Russians and, who got their money after the fall of communism or whatever in the land grab that took place then, perhaps some dodgy Africans or some dodgy people from the Middle East in the oil trade or something. You can be sure that there are plenty of people more dodgy than Nigel Farage who have accounts with Coutts and who do not ally with Coutts' core values, whatever they are. We have a thing called, it's been named Brexit derangement syndrome and Farage derangement syndrome. And it's a bit like Trump derangement syndrome, where people just have this irrational hatred of Donald Trump and Nigel Farage of Brexit. I think it derives from the fact that they are city, metropolitan, liberal elite types, and they can't reconcile the fact that their worldview does not tally with the worldview of the majority of the country. So Donald Trump won the general election in 2016. Farage won the Brexit vote for Britain. And there are just people who just cannot stand the fact that the majority of British people did not want to be part of the greater administrative body that is the European Union. And so this derangement syndrome has evolved. And Farage being debanked, if you like, is a symptom of that. Coutts is run by metropolitan elite types, and they obviously hated the fact that Farage was with them.
I can anticipate what some, let's say, co-ideologists of mine looking at this situation might say. They might say, this is all a terrible shame, but after all, Coutts is a private company and can do as it likes. Now, most people who make this kind of argument are left liberals who would never dream of saying, oh, a bank wants to remove the accounts of a prominent black politician who champions civil rights. Well, it's a private company. They would never speak that way. Never. They always trot out the it's a private company thing when that private company does something that it enjoys, that makes it happy. And my response to the it's a private company argument would be, first of all, even if it were 100% private company, I would still say I'm allowed to criticize it. And you may not have this problem in the UK, Dom, but over here in the libertarian world, you're dealing sometimes with very, very stupid people. They believe in the caricature of libertarianism that says that whatever a business does, that's the free market. So if you get an overcooked steak at the restaurant, well, apparently you can't return it because the free market produced that steak. So you got to just sit there and eat it. I don't know where this comes from, but I am absolutely allowed to criticize anybody I want at any time. And one of them would be an institution like this. But on the other hand, there's also the fact that when you look at the cartel system that exists, that has been created, that we refer to as the banking system in the United States and the UK and elsewhere, with the central bank at the top of it, this is a cartel system that has government-granted privileges at the heart of it. So in what real sense is this a free market institution anyway? That's a legitimate question. And then when I give you the American example of a prominent debanking, I've got, I think, still yet another argument to make on this front. But what do you say? Would you say something like, well, there are some things that even a private company shouldn't be allowed to do? Or how do you navigate that argument?
Well, it's really interesting. And something I've observed in the ongoing culture wars, Tom, and all sides are as guilty of this sin, if you like, but it's how whatever side of the culture war will cite whatever argument is necessary in order to attack their ideological enemy. So you see the left citing, well, it's a free market, and they would never cite it under other circumstances. But it's like people will use whatever weapon is available to them at the time, never mind the intellectual inconsistency of it. And that's an observation I've made in the ongoing political arguments that we're living through. But in the case of Farage, and that argument has been used against Farage, Coutts is a private bank, it's up to them what they want to do. But here's the irony. The NatWest Group, of which Coutts is a part, was bailed out by the taxpayer in 2008 during the global financial crisis. And it's actually 45% owned by the government. So it's not an entirely private bank. So that's the first point. The second point is a purist libertarian will say, yes, it's a free market, they can choose what they like to do. But reality is a lot more muddy than the purist idyll. And the fact is that banking uses fiat money, and fiat money is the issuance of government. So as soon as you're using fiat money, it's no longer a free market. Secondly, banking is a heavily regulated industry, and those regulations come from government. So again, it's not a free market if you're going to be purist about it. And thirdly, part of those regulations, there are certain rules that have been set And one of those rules is that a person's personal values cannot be held against them when it comes to how they bank. As long as you're not doing anything illegal, which Farage wasn't, then it doesn't make any difference what race you are, what creed, because this is a creed thing, but what color, creed, age, whatever. But this is what this is. This is a creed thing. So those rules are there. And while those rules are there, the bank has to abide by them. So it's not a free market. So that's what I would say in answer to your comments. There are loads of people that this is happening to, and Farage have then applied for 10 other banks. He couldn't get a bank account. And you can't, one of the biggest problems in the world is the unbanked. One of the reasons they have such poverty is that they are not banked. You cannot, with credit cards in a cashless society, how are you supposed to survive without a bank account? It's impossible. So it's a really powerful weapon. And it's funny because libertarians, traditionally, libertarians' enemy is the state. Libertarians' enemy is the government. We believe in free markets and all that kind of thing. But actually, in this instance, our enemy is a creed. It's a religion. It's the religion of wokeness. It's the religion of anti-Trumpism. It's the religion of the metropolitan elite. I don't even know what to call the religion, but we all know what I mean. It's a belief system. And this mentality has taken hold in so many institutions, whether it's Twitter before Elon Musk or YouTube or in the banking system. It is a very powerful thing, and nobody fights for it because of individual career risk. You're sat in a meeting and people are going, we have to get rid of Farage's account because he's racist and blah, blah, blah. Well, you're not going to speak up and defend Farage because you're thinking, I want to get promoted in this bank, so I'm just going to keep my mouth shut and let it happen. And that mentality proliferates through our institutions. And it means the aggressive woke have control. And it's bizarre because they are imposing effectively the Chinese social credit rating. Do you have the right views? Yes, you can progress in society. Do you have the wrong views? No, we're going to stop you from doing whatever it is. And it's everywhere. It's in the media. Who do we give this guy, this acting job to? The guy with the right views or the guy with the wrong views? Who do we give this directing gig to? Who do we have presenting our next show? It's everywhere. And those with the wrong views are effectively no platform. They're relegated to second-class citizen status. It's a form of prejudice. And actually in the UK, the government has actually run to Farage's defense and they lent on NatWest. And so the government has bizarrely actually been the protector of the rights of the individual. And in that letter that you just read to me there, they're calling on the government to be the protector of the individual. And that's what the government's supposed to do. So it's like libertarians have this new enemy, which is this woke religion, creed mindset that's taken hold.
Well, it's a vision that the problems that we see in the world are due to the fact that other people are just not as bright or as compassionate as they are. And that there are all these solutions out there waiting to be discovered, and they have them. And that these solutions are to be imposed upon the rest of us by the power of government through taxation or in other ways. And what's really crucial about it is that their passion is so much greater than the passion on the other side, largely because what they have involved is more.
Who is the they?
Oh, the media elite, the academic elite, political elites. And the reason we can talk about their vision, even though they obviously vary in their opinions, is that the basic set of underlying assumptions about the world are very similar. And because these assumptions are the prevailing assumptions, the need to find evidence for them or to offer proof is much less. If something happens, they'll explain it in a way which will fit that vision. For example, when they find that prenatal care is less among blacks than among whites, and that infant mortality rates are higher, they immediately assume this is because of society's neglect, and therefore if only the government will step in and provide more prenatal care, that problem solves itself. But in reality, other groups have even less prenatal care than blacks and don't have any more infant mortality than whites. But they don't ever get to that second stage because once they've seen something that fits their conception of how the world works, that's sort of the end of it.
Let me go back to that idea of who the they is.
So you got the New York Times, the Washington Post, Harvard, Stanford, all the usual suspects. I think that when people say things like, more American wives are battered on Super Bowl Sunday, you see, than any other time of the year, and there's not a speck of evidence for that, that is calculated. Because there is no data that could even be misinterpreted that way. In other words, because there's no data, period. And so, yes, but I think that 99% of the people who believe it are not calculating. Mm-hmm. I think one of the reasons that it flies without even being challenged for evidence is that there is a certain vision of how the world is, and in that world, men are oppressing women, and therefore, when you say something like this, it fits the vision, and that's the end of it. There's no demand for evidence. There's a four-stage pattern, and in the first stage is what I call the crisis, and so we're hyped to believe that something is a terrible crisis for which something must be done. What was fascinating to me in doing the research for the book is that very often the thing that's said to be in crisis has often been getting better for years on end, but that gets ignored. Then the second stage is,
for example, infant mortality, to use one of the
I'm thinking about teenage pregnancy and venereal disease. Those things were getting better. Teenage pregnancy was going down for more than a decade before sex education was introduced. Venereal disease, syphilis in 1960s had only half the incidence that it had in 1950. So all these things are going down, yet we're said to need sex education to deal with this crisis, which is then manufactured. And again, this is where the calculated part comes in. Now, 99% of the people who hear this don't know that. But the reason they accept it is because they also share the same vision. And because this is consonant with that vision, they don't have to ask for evidence.
All right, so what?
Anyone in this country could tell you what this anonymous intelligence officer says to Seymour Hersh in this piece this morning. The reality is that the balance of power in the war is settled. Putin has what he wants. Access to Crimea and the 4 eastern oblasts there. Ukraine does not have them and cannot get them back. And that's it. And so, they don't have all of Donetsk. They have almost, virtually all of Luhansk, but they don't even have all of Donetsk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson, but they will, or at least certainly the Ukrainians are not going to be able to take back what the Russians already have. With the amount of their defensive lines and so forth. If they were going to ever get any of that back, it's going to be at the negotiating table. You tried to take 4, you can have 2 or something, right? But everybody already knows, and this is what critics said from the very beginning. Noam Chomsky, for example, said more than a year ago, a year and a half ago at the start of the war. Well, let's see. Either Russia wins outright, which is a catastrophe, or Ukraine wins outright, which is an impossibility and would probably lead to the use of nuclear weapons if America gave them that much support to actually get it done, assuming that's even possible at all. Or the third option is negotiations at a table. Shouldn't we do that now rather than later? And remember, as you covered, of course, Dave, Admiral Milley at the end of October said, you guys got a great advance there in Kherson and in Kharkiv, and you ought to quit right now while you're as good as you're going to get. And they ignored him. Anthony Blinken and the diplomats overruled the Joint Chiefs' advice and said, just keep fighting.
Yeah. And going back to that Hersh piece, I think it was the intelligence official he spoke to mentioned how Blinken, just the other day, he's putting out this totally phony narrative that Russia, has lost, that Russia isn't going to get what it wants. And then that official goes on to mention, well, he has this, land bridge to Crimea. And yeah, they would probably want more territory in these oblasts that they control. And he mentioned something interesting, saying, I don't know what the fate of Odessa is going to be. Because if you remember earlier in the war, there were some Russian generals saying that they basically wanted to take Ukraine's entire Black Sea coast. So that's another big question is, okay, this Ukrainian counteroffensive fails, then what is Russia going to do next? And I think there's a chance they might go for Odessa and try to push into these oblasts and take advantage of Ukraine losing a lot of its troops in this counteroffensive. So yeah, that might be what the next year kind of holds for us. And
they had Kharkiv and they lost it. They might very well try to take Kharkiv back. Yeah,
that's true as well. They're all ready to keep arming Ukraine and keep it as this NATO bulwark on Russia's border. And the territorial control isn't really what's important right now to NATO. It's just about keeping Ukraine what it is. This NATO outpost right on the Russian doorstep there.
Yep. Yeah, it's true. As Prigozhin said, that this has redounded to the Americans and Britain's, priorities over the Germans, for example, this whole time. They've added 2 new NATO members and all these things. So if it's a question of strategically weakening Russia, as they keep putting it, we're getting such great bang for our buck here. This is the cheapest war we've ever fought and all this stuff,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's what you hear from people like Lindsey Graham and all the hawks in Congress. They're saying, oh, this is a low cost for us. We should just keep funneling money into this war and for as long as we can.
And these young Ukrainians getting blown to bits literally just belong in parentheses. Well, they're getting blown to bits. But anyway, let's talk about the bad news in the Pacific Ocean then too, Dave. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure which order. Let's do Tomahawks in the Philippines because that's the thing that I'm most mad about this morning.
Yeah, so the U.S. Marine Corps has activated a Tomahawk missile battery. And this is a missile system, a land-based ground-launched missile system that was previously banned under the INF treaty that the Trump administration withdrew from in 2019. And this is kind of what it's all about. Why the U.S. withdrew was to create these missile systems so they could station them near China. And the Tomahawk missiles have a range of about 1,000 miles, which was banned under the INF for ground-launched missiles. And, the U.S. accused Russia of violating the INF treaty by developing this new cruise missile. And from what I understand from the arms control people you've spoke with, the U.S. might have had a legitimate grievance there, but Russia also had a legitimate grievance with these Aegis Ashore missile systems, anti-ballistic missile systems that the U.S. put in Romania and Poland because they use these Mk-41 launchers that can fit Tomahawks. Well, the new battery that the Marine Corps just activated also uses the Mk-41 missile launcher. So, Russia's worries were not unfounded. And it was actually, I was just looking back, a few weeks after the U.S. formally withdrew from the INF Treaty in August 2019, just a few weeks after that, they were testing these Mk-41 ground-launched missiles, with this range. So this was, the plan all along.
And now the treaty banned not just tipping them with nukes, but banned the deployment of the missiles themselves in Europe, at least. But then I guess I need to reread that treaty. It banned them from the Pacific too, I guess. Well, the Soviets did have, let's see, INF was 87. So yeah, so the Soviets, they do have an East Coast in the Pacific, right? So
yeah, banned them altogether, like the development, testing, and totally banned them. And that's the thing, the Trump administration, even if, you say they basically wanted to pull out of this so they could make these missiles to put them in Asia. And Russia has offered a moratorium on the deployment of INF missiles in Europe. And the U.S. has not taken Russia up on that offer.
Yeah, but wait, that can't be right because, they use Tomahawks in Iraq, for example. They have ship-fired Tomahawks and that kind of thing, so.
Yeah, ship-fired, but not ground-launched.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's specifically ground-launched missiles. And
Gotcha. So these ones that they're putting in the Philippines and wherever else over there, as far as we know, they're not putting in nukes yet, but they're installing the launch systems. Is that right?
Yeah. So, and they haven't been deployed yet to the Philippines or Japan, but that is the plan. So they just activated this first battery at this Marine Corps base in California. And I know, there's no plans right now for them to be tipped with nuclear weapons, as far as I know.
So they're supposed to be in California, what, anti-ship missiles for China's impending invasion of California? Is that it?
Well, the plan is to eventually deploy them to Japan, Okinawa, the Philippines. They want to deploy them along what they call the first island chain, so they can hit, the Chinese mainland. It's all part of this, military buildup in the region there.
But they only have a range of how many miles?
1,000.
Oh, okay.
But this is the first time.
And I guess they're ship-based nukes. He also took them off the ships. But this is the first nuclear sub, you're saying?
Yeah. And, this is just an intentional provocation, just for the sake of provocation, because we know the nature of these nuclear armed submarines. They could be anywhere, and they have really long-range missiles. So there's not like a strategic value to, placing them in South Korea. The only purpose is to say, hey, look, we got nukes right here. We'll nuke you. And this is about North Korea, obviously. The president of South Korea, Yoon, who came in last year, said he was going to take a harder line against North Korea. And since then, the U.S. and South Korea have resumed these massive war games, and North Korea is launching all these missiles. But this is also about China, the U.S. flexing their muscle more in the region. They're kind of, I think, giving Yoon whatever he wants just because they could threaten China as well with all this stuff. So, the situation in Korea, it seems like it's not getting much attention, but it's very volatile again, unfortunately.
Well, and the North has been testing missiles too, right? Including cruise missiles, right?
Yeah, and ballistic missiles, ICBMs, and what they say are ICBMs.
What's stage two?
That stage two is
the first one is there's a crisis.
Yes.
They establish a crisis, usually an artificial one.
Yes. Okay. Then stage two is the solution. You have a solution for this crisis. In this case, you have sex education in the schools. And then at that point, you say, if we do this, this will lead to beneficial result A. The critics say, no, it'll lead to detrimental result Z. Stage three, you put it into the results. You put it in, and directly you find detrimental result Z, namely venereal disease and teenage pregnancy take off into the stratosphere. And then stage four is the fascinating part, in which they simply say, no, that doesn't prove that this was a bad policy, because there are many factors. There's complexity. It's simplistic to blame it on this. But they run through this routine on so many different things, including crime. Similarly, they said, in 1960, Judge Bazelon said we just desperately need to have some kind of change in the criminal justice system. Now, in 1960, there were fewer murders than there had been in 1950, 1940, or 1930. But again, that was completely ignored. And so now we have the revolution in the criminal justice system. People say, no, if you have put these new things in, there'll be more crime than before. They put them in. Almost instantly, the declining crime rate turns around and heads up again. And they say, no, it's simplistic to blame this on this. There are the root causes and the neglect of society and all the rest of it. So it's heads I win, tails you lose.
You think the increase in venereal disease was caused by sex education?
I don't have to even say that. I don't even have to believe that. All I have to say is
But do you?
Oh, I think it's hard to explain otherwise. You don't get social changes that drastic in a few years without some particular cause. But the argument doesn't depend on that at all. The point is they created the crisis artificially. The evidence shows there was no crisis. But they would not even subject it to any empirical test. If they want to show some other factor came in and really caused this, I'm happy to hear that.
Now, why would a group of liberal intellectuals or politicians or media stars or whatever, why would they sit around and decide to dismember or dilute the criminal justice system if they thought in advance that it would raise the amount of criminality?
Oh, they didn't think that, but the point is...
They just thought wrongly that it would help.
Yes, but it would also give them an enormously larger role than they had before. I mean, a judge who just sits there and applies the laws that have been passed by the legislature has a very minor role. But if he takes the expansive judicial activist role, then of course he's on the leading edge. Similarly with the war on poverty, you can show how dependency on government was going down, poverty was going down before this program was ever put in. And within a few years, dependence on government was going up. And after a few more years, the absolute number of people in poverty was going up. This was sold to the country, not on the grounds that if you transferred money from A to B, that B would have more money. That was not the argument. The argument was that dependency would be reduced. This will then, you give them job training and all those kinds of things, parenting skills, the whole bit. And this will then be an investment that will pay off in the future because there'll be fewer people dependent upon the government than there were before. And I go through a great number of people from John F. Kennedy to Lyndon Johnson, the New York Times, again, all the usual suspects. The first order of business is to evade the criterion that they themselves set up when they set this out. And so no matter what happens, if it's a failure by the original criterion, then we just find another criterion by which it will be a success.
Bipartisan cooperation and a string of
Okay, Mitch. Anything else you want to say? Sure, good. You want to say anything else to it first? Let's go back.
Go ahead, John.
All right, and there it is. It was uncomfortable and bizarre and kind of sad. Also, probably the most compelling speech Mitch McConnell's ever given. But that's we're grading on a curve. Yeah, I don't know. It's horrible, obviously. So go ahead.
I think this shows how much of a badass he is. That firstly, everyone's tolerated a whole career of him talking so slowly that it took 30 seconds before they even realized that he wasn't continuing.
It is true. There was like a good 30 seconds there where the rest of his guys were like, no, this is just what he does. He's
taking his time. Don't worry, he's got this.
Slow but steady wins the race.
That's also the most composed medical failure. You know, that's like when there was a scene in It's Always Sunny when Dennis Reynolds, he hits like the boxing machine and he goes, woo, and then he turns to his friend very composed and he goes, I just broke every hand in my body. That's what this was like. Like, that's a full-fledged freak out. But whatever way, that guy's such a super politician of being in front of the cameras. He doesn't shit his pants. He doesn't convulse on the floor. He doesn't start, having his hair dye leak. He just stands there silently and stoically. That's pretty incredible.
It was something. I mean, not a lot of information has been.
Producer with breaking news that we don't know that he didn't actually shit himself. And you know what? You're right. I shouldn't speak.
You were fact-checked in real time. There has been no evidence that he didn't shit himself. Look, what this really gets at. And it's interesting because this moment kind of brought it up, and now I see a lot of people talking about it. And it's a dynamic that we've talked about a bit on the show before that kind of fascinates me. And I got to say, I don't exactly understand why this is, but there is this class of boomer politicians who simply refuse to give up the reins of power. It's very bizarre. And I mean, it's not like just like one or two figures. It's like so many of them. I mean, just reading off here. So Mitch McConnell, who we just watched, he's 81. He's a year older than the president, Joe Biden, who is 80. Trump, of course, who's running again, is only a couple years shy of 80. Nancy Pelosi is 83. Dianne Feinstein is 89. Chuck Grassley is 89. The list goes on and on. And now you've gotten to a point where it is like outrageously dangerous that these are the guys at the helm controlling so much political power. I don't think at a certain point it's not unreasonable to say, look, I mean, if you saw this out of your pilot on an airplane, you'd be like, whoa. I mean, I don't mean to be rude, but someone's got to check in and decide, I do not think this is safe for this person to be flying a plane. And I think you could argue that making decisions on war and peace, making decisions on the economy, making decisions on energy policy, all of these things are analogous to flying a plane. People die if you get these decisions wrong. There's this new term, relatively new over the last few years. We never really needed a term for it before, and it is debanking. I don't know if you saw, Rob, that Nigel Farage was recently debanked. And evidently there's been some recourse for that. I think someone from the bank actually was resigned over it, and it looks like he might be getting that back. But of course, this was a major factor in the freedom protests in Canada a couple years back. This has been a major thing with political dissidents, however you want to phrase it, people who have gotten their banks shut down. This has happened in America to several people.
I don't know if people quite realize what it means to have the possibility that the government can just say, and this guy was a big enough politician that he was able to, people were able to find out about it. If that were to happen, let's just say you and I were only comedians and we didn't have the large podcast, and we made some joke in a club that the government decided they didn't like, and so we're being debanked. Where do you go? Who do you tell? You become a crazy guy in your street corner yelling about how the government took your money, and everyone's like, well, what is that guy talking about?
Yeah. Now, of course, from the libertarian perspective, I think how we tend to look at this and go kind of what you were getting at, that it's like, well, look, these rules are all set up to basically consolidate banking power. So there's very few big banks. This would be much better. A great solution to this would be to say, just allow for, like, look, the market would have broken up all of these big banks back in 2008. And you know what I mean? You'd have many more options. It would be much more difficult to get you debanked from every bank. Like, one of the scary things now is that there's only so many big banks that you're like, oh, so it's, if they convince the 5 to debank you, then you're kind of like almost not a person in modern world anymore. You've really been unpersoned. There wouldn't be 5, there would be 70, you know what I mean? If we had more of a free market, it'd be much more difficult to convince all of them. You also wouldn't have the fact, people say, oh, well, you can go to these other, you can go to some of these smaller banks or credit unions or things like that. The problem is that those institutions don't get preferential treatment from the Federal Reserve. And so you're much less protected in many ways in those banks. So there's lots of issues like that. However, I don't think it's unreasonable for libertarians to say, short of a free market in banking, which we're pretty damn far from, short of like tearing apart the whole Federal Reserve structure, which obviously would be the ideal solution, that this just should be illegal. It just should be illegal for banks to debank someone over their political views. And I'm sorry, I mean, you can make it, in the same way that it should be illegal for you to like leave the Senate and then go work for Raytheon and get paid $100 million a year. Like, it's, yes, ideally we would just not have the government, like funneling money into Raytheon. But given that we do, you shouldn't be allowed to do that. And given that basically all of these big banks have been propped up by the taxpayer and by the US dollar, if they're going to take that type of government assistance, they absolutely it really does seem like it's kind of necessary. Like the First Amendment really means nothing if you can't be protected in some way that, you know what I mean? Like, certainly at the very least, the government should not be allowed to, communicate with big tech companies and request censorship of people. They shouldn't be able to request that from banks. And I would even go further and say these big banks that are all completely, essentially government institutions, they should not be allowed. They should be forced to respect the First Amendment in that sense. That you have the right to say what you want to say without getting debanked. It's just, this is madness.
A lot of the things that came out of the Great Society, building all those junior colleges and community colleges.
Oh, I would disagree entirely. I think it was a tragedy of the first.
That was a tragedy.
Yes.
Why is that a tragedy?
You have millions of people who have absolutely no desire for an education, using up billions of dollars of the taxpayers' money, and not only not getting an education themselves, making it more difficult to give an education to those people who came to college with an idea of getting one.
Now, you say they have no desire for an education. I mean, nobody is herding them into these community colleges and into the junior colleges and into the state university. I mean, they have a desire, obviously.
No, they do not, obviously, because lots of things go on in those places that are not education. I mean, where else can you find so many young people of the same age and opposite sex in one place? A nice, convenient place to be. But anyone who is taught in a lot of these places, this ferocious desire for education as such is not terribly visible.
We've set up a society where you have to be credentialed with a certain amount of college, so aren't they able to get a better job?
No, this is the fallacy of composition. If one person stands up in the stadium, he sees the game better, but if they all stand up, they don't all see the game better. As long as, if you have a degree and the other guy doesn't, then you get ahead of him in the employment line. But we're not going to all get ahead of each other in the employment line by all getting degrees.
We have to get more people into the education system because that's the way to compete. And we look at the data and we see that the people with more education are earning more money than ever before relative to the people with less education. That's all a fallacy of everybody standing up in the stadium.
People who fly on the Concorde, kids who've flown on the Concorde undoubtedly will make more money than kids who've only gone on buses. That does not mean if we put a lot of people on the Concorde, we're going to raise the national income. You can't blame the crime rate on the fact that there's more poverty. There's less poverty. There's more affluence. It's not due to foreigners because, as you say, we've won the Cold War. All the normal things that you might blame all this on aren't there. It's not because of diseases, because science has conquered more diseases. It's all because of self-inflicted wounds. And I'm saying these are the people who inflicted those wounds, and this is why we shouldn't listen to them anymore.
What are the nature of those wounds?
Crime.
No.
The disintegration of the family. The disintegration of the educational system. And it's not going to matter. We'll be like the man who gained the whole world and lost his soul.
Is there a common root to all of those problems?
It's the notion that ordinary people cannot be trusted to make the decisions that they've been making, but these must be preempted either by judges in the case of crime, by the schools taking over the indoctrination of other people's children behind their back and against their protests. Or what was the other one? The family taking money from the taxpayers and subsidizing behavior, as well as encouraging it and legitimizing behavior that has turned out to be enormously self-destructive, undermining the family in 1,000 different ways.
You make this vigorous attack in the Vision of the Anointed that we should no longer listen to these people. That's sort of the debate. They've been wrong. They don't prove their points. It's hurt us. Who should we listen to?
We should listen first and foremost to our own experience. You seem to act as if there must be alternative saviors. We should stop looking for saviors. I mean, the society has not existed for thousands of years because it had a succession of saviors. It's existed because it has institutions and processes through which people can realize their own goals.
No, I understand that, but you are attacking people who would like to lead us and tell us how the world works.
No, they don't want to tell us how the world works. They want to take over the decision for us. They don't tell the parents how they ought to teach sex education to their children. They put this material in the schools behind the backs of the parents with instructions not to let the parents see it.